Thank you. I understand that state law requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, city council committees are currently meeting remotely. We are using Microsoft Teams to make the remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of city council are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer. Prior to the hearings, they could also be found at philacouncil.com. I note that the hour has come. Eric, could you please call the roll to take attendance? Members that are in attendance, will you please indicate that you are present when your name is called? Also, please say a few brief words when responding so that your image can be displayed on screen when you speak.
Councilmember Quinones Sanchez.
Present.
Councilmember Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. Present.
Councilmember Thomas.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Good morning, colleagues. I'm present.
Councilmember Heenan.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and good morning, colleagues.
Councilmember Dom.
Good morning, Madam Chair, colleagues, and good morning, Eric.
Good morning. That is all, Madam Chair.
Thank you. A quorum of the committee is present, and this hearing is now called to order. This is a public hearing of the Committee on Appropriations regarding bills number 210077, 210120, and 210121. Will the clerk please read the title of all the bills? David?
Bill number 210077, an ordinance authorizing transfers and appropriations for fiscal year 2021 from the general fund, the council to the general fund, the Department of Planning and Development. Bill number 210120, an ordinance authorizing transfers and appropriations for fiscal year 2021 from the general fund, the council to the general fund, certain or all city offices, departments, boards, and commissions, and thereby implementing council's New Normal Jobs Initiative. And Bill number 210121, authorizing transfers and appropriations for fiscal year 2021 from the Grants Revenue Fund, the Director of Finance, provision for other grants to the General Fund, the Managing Director under certain terms and conditions.
Thank you. Before we begin to hear testimony from the witnesses we have for today, everyone who's been invited to the meeting to testify should be aware that the public hearing is being recorded. Because the hearing is public, participants and viewers have no reasonable expectation of privacy. By continuing to be in this meeting, you are consenting to being recorded. Additionally, prior to recognizing members for questions and comments they have for the witnesses, I will note for the record at this time that we will use the chat feature available in Microsoft Teams to allow only members to signify that they wish to be recognized in order to comply with the Sunshine Act. The chat feature must only be used for this purpose. David, will you please call the first panel we have to testify this morning on bills numbers 210077, 210120, 210121.
Yes, they are Marissa Waxman and Sarah DeWolf.
Ladies, can I see you?
Yeah, here we go. All right. Good morning. Good morning, Chairperson Quinones Sanchez and members of the Appropriation Committee. I have, of course, now having a weirdness with my PowerPoint showing. But I am Marissa Waxman, and I serve as the Budget Director for the City of Philadelphia. And I am joined today by Sarah DeWolf, the Recovery Officer and Deputy Finance Director for Policy and Practice. I'm here to offer testimony and support today of Bill number 210121. Bill number 210121 provides for a transfer within the Grants Revenue Fund to the General Fund Managing Director's Office for the purpose of supporting COVID response costs for the second half of the fiscal year. This ordinance is needed to support ongoing spending related to our COVID response, like quarantine and isolation, access centers for distance learning, and personal protective equipment for frontline employees. And so all of this money is being allocated to the Managing Director's Office so that we can centralize the COVID costs This is the same approach that we used for the first 85 million transfer ordinance that council approved last spring for COVID costs. It helps us group it all in one place, but we do anticipate that many different departments will have costs that are supported by this funding, but this helps us track it. We've allocated the funding in this transfer ordinance with 10 million to class 100, 20 million to class 200, and 20 million to class 300, 400. The reason we allocated this way is it's basically in line with our COVID spending to date in terms of by class. However, some of the costs are not yet known, so we're not able to do full sort of projections of the exact amount by class, but we think that this is what can happen. And the reason we're asking for this transfer ordinance is that we need to support ongoing spending in response to the pandemic. We still have a number of needs related to that personal protective equipment, continuing to support quarantine and isolation centers, providing supplies and food for access centers. So originally, when we got our CARES Act funding, $276 million, up until the very end, the expectation was that it all had to be spent by December 30th, 2020. However, we knew that we were going to have costs that continued on through the end of this fiscal year. And so we had structured that in such a way that we would be able to, even though the money all had to be spent by the end of 2020, that we were going to reimburse some of the personnel costs we had, reimburse the general fund, basically freeing up general fund dollars to spend for the rest of the fiscal year. And so the $50 million, because you might be asking, given that last week we announced that we're anticipating a $450 million budget gap for next year, where the heck did we get $50 million for continuing COVID costs? This had been part of our plan from the time we had gotten those CRF dollars to make sure that we could continue to support our pandemic response for the balance of the fiscal year. We are going to have to prioritize the spending of these funds, though. Honestly, in this response, our needs are tremendous. And so we have a process through which, first, if departments have an ask related to COVID response, if it's under $10,000, we ask the departments to try and absorb them. If you've got a $30 million budget, you need, a couple $100 worth of sanitizer, we ask departments to figure it out. But if you can't absorb it because you're a small department whose funds are already allocated, or if it's a much larger cost, then all of those requests are then going to be vetted by the Office of Recovery and Grants. And so we're looking for a couple things. One, is it a legitimate cost? And two, is there a source of grant funding that will pay for it other than this $50 million? This $50 million is sort of our last safety net for funding these, but if we can get FEMA or another grant stream outside the city to pay for it, we want to make that happen. And so that's the vetting that the Office of Recovery and Grants will do. If another funding source isn't identified and we need to apply a cost to this $50 million fund, basically weekly, the managing director, the finance director, and the mayor's chief of staff jointly review and approve and prioritize these requests. The types of expenditures, I've mentioned some of them already, but we've got to do the space rental and facilities management for those quarantine and isolation spaces. We've got temporary positions that are continuing at our emergency operations center. We're providing supplies and food at our access centers as long as distance learning continues. We still have remote working costs for some of our departments. Some of those are ongoing, some of them, still getting some of the equipment we need or the technology software so that folks can work from home. And then continuing to provide restroom and hand washing stations so that they can fill in where, one, just because for sanitation needs and preventing the spread, and two, to fill in because a lot of the public restrooms that the city normally offers are currently closed. And again, that personal protective equipment. So we have a lot of things we know that we're going to need. There's obviously going to be things that continue to come up over the coming months that we hadn't yet anticipated, which is why we're setting these funds aside. And then, so the question is, how are you going to know? Because there is still some uncertainty here. And so what we'll be doing to make sure that both council members and the general public are aware of how these funds are being used, there will be a monthly report to City Council from the Office of Recovery and Grants showing all of the approved costs that come through. Additionally, there will be a public-facing quarterly report on the recovery, which will include this information. So that's our summary of our request for this $50 million transfer ordinance to continue supporting pandemic response costs for the balance of FY21. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and I'm joined by my colleague Sarah DeWolf, the recovery officer, who can also help as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I pass it on to my colleagues for questions. So, Marissa, speak to me a little bit about the reconciliation of the first $85 million, right? And then with the extension of the utilization of CARES Act, how did that get reconciled in the first part of the year? And then how will this move the $50 million? What did we learn from that?
Sure. Actually, Sarah, do you mind stepping in and sort of describing both what we spent and the process we went through to work for that?
You're on mute, Sarah.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Sarah DeWolf, Recovery Officer. So for the first 85 million, if you'll remember, that was really in the second half of fiscal year 20. And we could apply the $276 million of coronavirus relief funds that we got. We could reimburse the general fund for some of those costs. We ultimately reimbursed the general fund for, I think it was 64 million of those costs. There were some costs that just weren't eligible based on the different requirements of the coronavirus relief fund. For example, things like hazard pay. So not all of those costs were reimbursed, but some were. And I think your second question was about the 276 million. So yeah, if you'll remember the timing, so the deadline for that grant has been extended by a year. But that decision wasn't finalized until 3 days before the original deadline. The president signed it on December 27th, and the original deadline was December 30th. So we had really fully obligated that funding at that point. And while, we're still collecting invoices and kind of doing final reconciliations around that funding, we expect it to be fully obligated and expended, hence the need for this additional 50 million.
Marissa, can you speak to me? I'm a little concerned around some of the expenditure line items as it relates to this, because I've yet to see, and if you can speak to where were the savings under COVID that departments had? And so how are you making decisions between stuff that isn't happening and expenditures, the savings per department? Because it appears to me that there, access centers, there's other program money. Again, if it's CARES qualifying, it's one thing, but now we're not dealing with CARES funding. And until this new relief comes in, how are we making sure that savings are happening before new expenditures for new programs happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things I mentioned is there are times where we ask departments, if you can absorb this. We still do want folks documenting if we think that it can be reimbursed, because given the precarious situation we're in, we might want those savings so that when we, for our fund balance or when we return to normal. So if we can get reimbursed, we want to track it that way. But we are having areas where we are seeing savings, and we just put out our quarterly city managers report, and in there, everything is like, well, this cost went up, but this cost went down. The net impact was whatever. And so there's a lot of areas where we are seeing some costs go down. And I will say probably overall, the biggest one that we're seeing across many different departments is savings related to special events, because we are not having them for the most part. There's obviously some events are happening, First Amendment activities, but unfortunately, all of the joyous ones, they're not happening. And so we're seeing savings in a lot of departments that typically expend overtime related to those special events. We are actually, though, so as a result, our overtime projections for FY21 are, I would say, about more than 20 million lower than FY20. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of these savings. But at the same time, we're also seeing cost increases that we haven't really all allocated to those COVID costs. So some departments, a lot less overtime because we're not doing those. In the last quarter, we revised down our overtime numbers for L&I and for free library. And so there are places where that's coming down, but there's also places where it's continuing to go up. And there's a couple different drivers. For example, in our fire department, one, they're continuing to have the pandemic response doing activities that are not, things that more, 13 months ago we would have expected. They're also faced with staff being out because of illness or having to quarantine if there's been an exposure. But we then have to backfill those staff because we don't just say, whoops, the fire trucks and ambulances don't go out today. So we're seeing sort of pushes and pulls, areas where our costs are going up, even just to deliver our core services. We are seeing other areas where those costs are going down. And in some cases, we're reallocating, within departments just to absorb those. But over and above that, the costs we have related to the pandemic, we think can't be fully absorbed, which is why we were moving this money from the grants fund to the general fund.
As it relates to protocol, what standards are we using? I know when we first talked about the overtime at the fire department, there was a 14-day quarantine. Are we still doing 14 days? What is the standard? The CDC recommendations is 5 to 7 days with testing. How have we adjusted as we get more familiar with COVID and some of this work?
I don't know that answer right now, but I can, and Sarah's nodding her head that she does not either. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the fire department and the managing director's office to get an update on those for you.
I'd like to see a protocol across the board, because that's one of the apprehensions is one department gets 14 days quarantine, one department gets 10, one department gets 7. It's sort of like, how is this evolving as the CDC recommendations come out about what is the standard? I think it's important. So I want to ask a little bit around the quarantine and isolation spaces. There's a lot of concern around the cost. Sarah, can you speak to us, and I know that the advocates have been talking about the unsheltered population. What, if in fact, are we spending on a daily basis in these hotels versus moving that money to more permanency situations?
Yeah, I'm aware of the issue that you mentioned. I don't have sort of a daily rate off the top of my head, but I could definitely provide that as follow-up. I think the important thing to highlight around the isolation, quarantine, and prevention spaces is that our primary funding source for those spaces, now that we don't have coronavirus relief funding to lean on, is FEMA public assistance. And FEMA is very clear that they see themselves as a provider of last resort. Being in a pandemic is very unusual, kind of unusual thing for FEMA to reimburse around. So we don't have a lot of precedent here. But what we're seeing and what we're hearing is that while FEMA may reimburse some of the actual hotel costs associated with isolation and quarantine, prevention is a riskier cost for FEMA to reimburse. And the longer out we get from that kind of March 14 original date, the less likely FEMA is to really fully reimburse both kind of all of the wraparound and behavioral health services that are associated with the prevention sites, which quite honestly, some of those costs are greater than the actual costs of the hotels themselves. So it just creates a big financial risk for us. And, that FEMA has made some policy changes, which I think people have cited and maybe incorrectly interpreted to mean that they're more likely to reimburse in this space. The Biden administration directed FEMA to do 100% federal cost share, which basically means, traditionally FEMA has required what they call a local cost share, which means they pay like 75% of what's reimbursed, and the city or the local municipality has to pay the 25%. But we've always had the state telling us that they're going to pick up that local cost share. So that policy change doesn't really mean much for us. And it doesn't mean anything about what FEMA is willing to reimburse. It just means once they make that decision, how much of that is covered by FEMA. More recently, like in late January, the president the new president has been issuing these directives to FEMA, and they've indicated that they may expand some of the categories of spending that they typically reimburse. And they have specifically mentioned isolation and quarantine, domestic violence shelters, also some costs associated with reopening schools. But they haven't issued any detailed guidance yet, and that's really what we're waiting for to better understand what that means for us. Because FEMA is very they're very strict about what they're going to reimburse. They basically have the highest standards of any agency. And so there's just, there's risk until we better understand what that means.
Okay. Well, let me encourage us to be proactive. I think what we've seen from the new federal administration is that they are willing to listen to cities if we have plans, right? If we say, this is a more productive utilization of resources. I think you've seen some movement on that. So let me encourage all of us to work in that space. And, the homeless shelters, the product lines that we have are going to have to change in a COVID world. And so we should really be using all of these opportunities to create what those long-term spaces are going to look like, and how do we transition people right into more appropriate settings. So let me encourage that. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I just wanted to add that is actually an area where we have been investing recovery funds. We've put money into creating barriers in shelters. So I just wanted to make it clear also that we have been investing in some of the modifications necessary for some of the more traditional homeless services programs.
Okay. I'm going to recognize Councilmember Thomas. I have a couple more questions, but I wanted to recognize Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. I'm sitting here listening to the testimony, and I think Councilmember Sanchez's line of questions just kind of raised some concerns for me that I just want to kind of get some clarity about. So you talked about your overtime projections. You said that they're 20 million lower. But then you spoke about fire. You didn't talk about police. Last year, towards the end of the year, council apprehensively voted for a transfer ordinance to address some of the overtime issues. And if my numbers serve me correct, about 57 million of that, those overtime dollars were to fire and police specifically. So with us anticipating that we're not going to be addressing the overtime issue with fire, and I believe it's 40 million with the fire, how can we realistically say that we anticipate $20 million less next year in overtime because of departments like L&I and the free library? Like, I don't know. Those numbers don't sound realistic to me. So I'm hoping maybe we can just revisit that and figure out how did we get to that point where we feel like we'll have less, especially when we saw a lot of different unpredictable factors in 2020, according to the administration, according to your testimony in last year's appropriations hearing. That was the reason why we've seen so much overtime, because of unpredictable things happening. So how do we justify that? I'm confused.
Great. Thank you so much for your question, Council Member. One thing I want to be clear is that of all the costs that I talked about for this $50 million transfer ordinance, we were not anticipating any of that being for sort of standard overtime. My response on the discussion of overtime had to do with more of the rest of the budget and what was going on there, and not these pandemic response. The costs we're really anticipating here for this transfer ordinance that we're testifying on today are around those quarantine and isolation spaces, the personal protective equipment. That's where our expectations are that we're going to use this.
I have a question or two about that as well too, but I referenced my question with the council members' line of questioning, led to this dialogue that now has me curious. So I understand that this is not directly related to today's transfer ordinance, but again, I'm in a hearing. I'm trying my best to be attentive in some of the numbers that were communicated as it relates to next year's overtime. It doesn't make sense to me. So I'm wondering, how do we get to the space where we feel like we'll have $20 billion less in overtime when we spent the majority of our overtime in a space where we don't anticipate spending less? Like, if anything, based on what I'm hearing, we're probably going to spend more in overtime on fire. More in police is unpredictable. So if those are the biggest line items as it relates to overtime, how do we anticipate spending less when the bigger line items are probably going to not be less?
All right, so thank you. So yes, in the quarterly city managers report that we put out on the 15th was a Sunday, the 16th. So last Monday, that's where we updated. And I know we've got a fiscal stability hearing on March 1st. And so we can start now and we can go into greater depth then, where we updated all of our revenue projections as well as our spending projections for FY21, our current year. And so sort of through that process, we had to make some adjustments. We made some assumptions and updated our revenue estimates based on actual collections so far year to date, as well as showing them funding coming over from the grants revenue fund to support these pandemic costs. When you netted all of that out, that actually looks good. But unfortunately, those grant dollars that we got and those reimbursements are actually masking that we have further reduced our tax estimates by about $40 million. And so we've got some challenges there. We then, at the same time, as we were looking at our data through the end of Q2, updated all of our spending projections for departments. And so, as I mentioned, part of that was updating our overtime projections to try and refine those better. Now, generally, we've got a class 100 budget, and in a normal year, really what we care about is the overall class 100, because overtime is a tool that we use to deliver services, and there can be different ways to do that, and overtime is one of those ways. But we have seen, as you've pointed out, so much uncertainty in the past year that those can really fluctuate. And so that is why we've continued to update all of our projections. And so we just did that through the end of the second quarter. And so as we've done that, we are continuing to update our estimates. We had to increase our estimate for FY21. However, it remains lower than our actual spend from FY20, as the councilwoman mentioned, because obviously there are areas where we are doing more, there's areas where we're doing less. I will say, though, that as we were doing those updates, a lot of snow was coming down. And so streets department, as we have had more snow than we've had in years, while they do maintain a snow reserve, the challenges of whether or not that'll be adequate in this particular year are questions. So we continue to update and refine, and that's in part why we do those quarterly managers reports. Also, they're required by law for PICA, but it helps us stay on top of what is changing with all of those uncertain circumstances you have, and being able to figure out where, if we have an unavoidable cost in one area, what levers do we have to toggle back in others? And so that's what we're sort of doing consistently throughout the year.
Well, thank you. I won't belabor that because I know that that's not the topic today. I just wanted to raise that point, and I understand your response, but I am, please don't mind if we're skeptical. That's our job on this side of this side of things. As it relates to this is my last question. As it relates to the quarantine and isolation centers as well as the access centers, what capacity are they operating at? So I know that we're funding them to serve a certain amount of people. I'm wondering what percentage, as far as seats we're paying for, are actually being occupied in both. And after that, I'm done. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Great. I know I don't have stats on that off the top of my head. Do you have those, Sarah?
Don't.
Okay, we can get back to you in terms of, and obviously there's fluctuations, but we'll get back to you with the occupancy on those quarantine and isolation sites as well as the access centers. And that was, I know, one of the challenges that we've really had is, also what surge nursing facilities, things like that, how do they're not things you can bring online the day that you need them. And so trying to gauge that, but we will get back to you with those occupancy stats.
And again, because that's a new program, what is the cost per student? I'm of the belief that, if we want to help families, we need to be flexible for them. And so there was a value to them in the beginning. Are we better off giving folks grant money for them to pick providers based on their new reality as you transition, as we open schools and do all that stuff? I'm concerned about us turning temporary things into permanent things, that are really not evidence-based. And again, I know people wanted to respond to certain things, but I believe there was a lot of savings that could have really should have been realigned with that. And I want to emphasize that a lot, because I know that when we get to the fiscal stability, I think that government has operated differently under COVID, and I'm very concerned that we're just spending as opposed to realigning. And when you make a presentation and you say we're going to have a budget deficit, there's this fear of we'll have to bring up taxes. We're not going to take care of gun violence and some of the vulnerable issues that have been highlighted over the last year, the disparities and, outright discriminatory practices that have led us to those disparities. So, we need to have an honest discussion about what are we doing? What is government doing? What it should be doing, and how do we protect the most vulnerable? And we can't have that discussion if the first thing is we're going to have a deficit, and yet departments haven't realigned to the new reality. And I haven't seen much of that. I've met with a lot of department heads, and I said to them, guys, the world has changed and people are still operating the same way. And that's not going to be acceptable in this budget coming up. But, I don't want to start the conversation from the most needy and the most vulnerable are the ones that have to give up when we have some structural issues that have to be realigned. And I don't know that people are listening, Marissa, to what we're talking about. So, departments, the world has changed, right? And so outside of the overtime for special events, there should be a lot more savings going on and realignment in those departments. So I won't belabor it. Any other questions related to this one so we can go on to the next bill? Okay. So bill number 210120, that's basically a council one. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Marissa.
No, we're not offering testimony on the remaining two bills.
Okay. These are mostly council new normal department issues, and then some expenditures around the commitments that we've made. Is there anything related to Bill 210121, Marissa, that we should be aware of?
210121. Nope. Just the testimony we've already offered.
Okay. Any of my colleagues have any additional questions? Okay. Seeing none. One last thing. When Sarah mentioned there's in the reconciliation of the first $85 million, there was a $64 million reimbursement from the CARES Act. Could we see that? Where is that money shown? Is it just going to be part of the general fund balance?
I think that should show up in our CAFR, our annual financial report. I'm not sure. Marissa, I'd look to you. I'm not sure where else that shows up in our budget documents.
So you can also see it when it is coming in from the grants fund. You can see it as a revenue, an update to our current projections in our revenues from other governments. So we update that as a revenue from another government coming into the general fund. And then we can show you more detail there if you want to see that. But it is sort of called out. You won't see the exact number because there's other things in that line, but you'll see the increase in our revenue from other governments line.
Okay. Because that, again, the reimbursements, kudos to the recovery office. I know you guys worked really hard at making sure all those expenses were covered and reimbursable. So I'm going to recognize Council Member Alan Dom and then Councilman Kenyatta Johnson. Alan? Councilmember Dom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to speak regarding 210121. Is a good time now?
Yes.
Since the Philly Fights COVID debacle, I've called upon the administration to do two things, which are consult with City Council on mass vaccination sites and show us the plan that has been developed for these sites to date. Last Friday, Health Commissioner Farley, in the overwhelming supported the convention site instead of Lincoln Financial Field. Then over the weekend, we saw what happened with the lack of foresight and planning when people waited in 8-hour lines for a vaccine with no public safety plan, no bathroom plan, and no seating plan. And we did not support the Leah Course facility at that time. there was no support for that operation. Thousands of our most at-risk Philadelphians stood outside for hours in the freezing cold to get their vaccines. The Inquirer reported that elderly patients with diabetes and heart conditions, some relying on oxygen tanks and walkers waiting for hours in the freezing cold, and then a rubbish fire, which was started to keep people in line warm, became dangerous at 6:30 p.m., forcing the Philadelphia Fire Department to respond and put it out an hour later. This situation became so dire this weekend that Dr. Stanford, head of the Black Doctors COVID-19 Consortium, had to, quote, bring seniors inside for their safety, end of quote. The Inquirer further reported a 50-year-old female with diabetes and heart disease arrived at 9 a.m. and joined the walk-up line early when the line was at Broad Street and Cecil B. Moore Avenue. Still outside the building at 4 p.m., she said she hadn't eaten and struggled to find somewhere to use the bathroom. Her quote in the paper, I'm grateful this is being made available to people, but they need to make facilities available. My hands are numb, my feet are numb. It's way too cold for people to be out in this weather for hours and hours. It's kind of end of quote. She deserved better, and so did the thousands of people who showed up over the weekend. But yet again, where was the plan for this event from the administration, including Health Department and Office of Emergency Management? Where is the plan? This is an indoor facility with outdoor problems that should have had a plan for managing the safety of our residents, knowing that thousands of the poorest and sickest among us were heading to the Leah Center to walk up for a vaccine in the next 24 hours. Knowing that temperatures all week and on that Friday were hovering at or below freezing, the city didn't have a plan to prepare for the inevitable. No food, no water, no porta potties, no EMS, no city personnel to assist Dr. Stanford when she felt the safety of those in line was being jeopardized. No plan. At the hearing last Friday, when people were waiting in the freezing rain for their vaccines, the health department advised us the mass vaccination had to be inside for safety reasons due to the weather, and then doubled down saying we wouldn't have the same problems at indoor facilities that we would have in an outdoor facility like the Link. An indoor facility only protects people from the freezing rain if you plan to bring them inside for their shots. We all need to ask ourselves, would Philadelphians standing in line, freezing in the cold at that indoor facility at Broad and Cecil B. Moore have fared better waiting in their heated cars or shuttle buses that night at Lincoln Financial? The failure of the administration to plan 3 weeks ago led to the Philly fighting COVID debacle. The failure to plan led to PHMC hijacking our vaccines for their non-eligible, non-resident employees. Their failure to plan led to the neglectful mistreatment of Philadelphians at the Leah Center last Friday. And once again, there's no plan. After 3 weeks of negotiations with FEMA, the health department told us on Friday, the plan is we have much to be worked out. Here's what I would like to see, Madam Chair, in a plan and what council deserves to know from that plan. A web platform that registers and schedules all vaccine appointments at the convention center during updates with online alerts and rescheduling capability should regularly schedule allocations expand or contract. An allocation plan detailing the safeguards the administration has put in place to ensure equity of access. A public safety plan that deals with the crowd control outside of the site and the homeless encampment at 13th and Filbert. A public transportation plan, whether discounted or free, that boosts our public transit routes from underserved neighborhoods to the convention center. And a parking plan, which lots we can use, how many parking spaces will be set aside, are they free or is it discounted parking to vaccine appointments at the convention center? So the administration, Madam Chair, is here today to ask us to release more money for COVID-related operations. But I will say it again, we still have not seen a plan in place that tells us the details we need to have for proper oversight of the distribution of the vaccine. We have generalizations and promises for more information. And at this point, along with the number of vaccines, my trust is also a scarce commodity. I asked the administration, will this money be used to pay for transportation to the convention center? Will it be used to reimburse people for parking or pay for public safety expenses to ensure people are safe while waiting in lines for vaccines? Will these resources be used to pay for marketing to those who we need to vaccinate in all of our neighborhoods, whether it be paying community partners to help organize people or paying for other programs to ensure equity of access? I hope there are clear plans as to how we plan to use this money, or I'm not sure why this is on the table today. Will this money be used to stand up a one-stop shop web platform that registers and schedules people for vaccinations? Montgomery County has figured this out with fewer resources than we have. I can't see voting for the release of funds here today until we have some assurances that this money will be spent wisely, because to date, we have not seen that happen. So I say, Madam Chair, no plan, no money. We have to stop this nonsense at some point. We deserve to know what's going on to happen when we hand over millions of dollars. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Dom. I don't know if Marissa had a comment or feedback around that.
No, just thank you. We heard you, and I'm not the right person to respond, but we heard what you're asking. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to, and I know Council President Clark, and what he doesn't like to do on Thursday, spoke to this, and Councilman Dom, as chair of this committee, I will work with Council President Clark before this bill goes to a final vote, that we have some of the items that you have highlighted. I know for all of us in council, the issue of what is happening locally in our districts as well as, citywide are hugely important. And I know that for just today, we're putting together a fact sheet for the 7th Councilmatic District, because we're getting calls about what is going on in the 7th Council District and trying to piece that together for people. My staff has been working on that, and you're right, we should have that readily available. When my mother calls me about an 88-year-old parishioner yesterday as she leaves church, I should be able to answer her right away. Now, I made some phone calls and I was able to get her an answer. But you're right, I think they're doing a better job with the website. This inability to put together a master list. I've often said in this council, I had my parents on 8 lists. It was just, it was ridiculous. So you're right to demand that. I think we're looking for that. I think Commissioner Farley spoke to some of that last week in the hearing and made some commitments around the dashboard so that we can get real-time information. But I think Council President Clark said it best on Thursday. We're going to make sure that council, particularly district council people, are working with their providers in their districts and making sure that we have more access. I also asked Farley on Friday, if we know that there's a disparity, and while we want to acknowledge the move from 8% African-American accessibility to 20%, but we're not going to get to parity if we don't oversubscribe to neighborhoods, in the way that Dr. Stanford did on Friday and Saturday. I went there on Friday. And I know that they were moving, seniors in the senior line in the building as frequently as they could. And, it was a massive operation. And I was there when Dr. Stanford had to call and get more vaccines. And I know that the administration responded and provided those additional vaccines on Friday night around 9:00 at night when it was clear that they were doing such a successful job that more were needed. And so we're not where we need to be. I'm absolutely want to just reiterate that what you've been asking for is basic, and we're going to work towards that. And if we don't feel like in a week or two, when this gets a final vote, that we're in a better place, I will join you in not giving final approval to this. The city of Philadelphia deserves that. So completely understand. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that, but you have my commitment that over the next week or two, as this moves for final vote, that we will have more clarity on those neighborhood-based plans and the citywide plan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have a question for our panel
Yes, Councilman Johnson does.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay,
Sorry,
Madam
Jason.
Chair. It's
Go
okay,
ahead.
Madam Chair. I just had a question for Marissa as well as Rob DeBoe. Is there a strategy regarding us lobbying the Biden administration regarding support for relief for our city? I know there's been a lot of talk about his current COVID relief proposal and funding that he wants to provide for the state, and so for states and cities. And so, is there a specific dollar amount that we're going after? And do you have any projected numbers that you are calculating as a part of the upcoming budget process? Just thinking ahead of time.
Yeah, no, thank you. I have to say it is exciting to be lobbying the White House with optimism. And so we haven't built any numbers into our FY22 budget. In order for us to do that, it has to be in law. We have been, however, very much lobbying the White House, telling them what we need, how much we need, doing this on our own, but also partnering with other cities. I know Rob signed onto a letter with CFOs from big cities across the country about a week or two ago. We've worked with our lobbyists. The short version of what we are saying is we need a lot of money. We need it to come directly to us, not filtered through the state, and we need it to be really flexible. We need to not only be able to cover some of the pandemic costs, but also address the revenue losses we've sustained, as well as so that we can continue to provide core government services. So that is something we have very actively been doing. It has also been great that we have been able to participate through various organizations. Members of council have also helped facilitate some of those connections through National League of Cities and other organizations. So we are very actively advocating for, please give us a lot of money, flexible money directly to us. We can't yet, however, budget that into our FY22 until we see a bill that's passed. We are hopeful that something will happen mid-March, and that's in part, or that is the primary driver for why we've delayed our budget introduction this year to mid-April, because we want to have that information and know about those dollars before we introduce the FY22 budget.
And then also there was a announcement last week that currently the projected budget deficit is $450 million. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you know what areas have already been cut thus far to make up for the deficit, the 450 deficit? Obviously, that money had to come from somewhere in terms of making some tough choices. Can you give us an overview?
So at this point, what we're continuing to say is everything's on the table because we're still working towards introduction. What we've been doing is a number of different things. We've been working with our departments to understand how they could do things different, how their services have realigned, how their costs are changing. We've also been trying to do a lot more outreach and engagement so that we understand that people's service needs have changed in the past year and what they want is different. We've already shifted a lot of our, a year ago, we weren't putting money into nearly as much rental assistance or getting folks on the internet. So, the food support. So we've already shifted some of what we're doing. We know that people's needs have changed. So actually, I would love help from council helping us. We have been doing focus groups with a number of different internal and external groups to the city. We've also put out a multilingual survey to Philadelphians asking for their input. And so, we're gathering as much. Right now, we are trying to understand what folks need. And that's going to help us decide what is then, funded in our proposal. We are also really hopeful that $450 million budget gap gets addressed in some part by funding from the federal government. One of our concerns, though, is that the money coming from the feds will be one-time money, whereas those budget gaps we see reoccurring. So even if that number is more than $450 million, we're not in the clear because we're going to have to stretch that money out and make it last over at least our 5-year plan, or when we think that our revenue streams are going to recover. So we're not there yet in terms of what's in the budget, what's not. We're really lobbying hard so that hopefully there's more money in the budget, but also trying to understand from folks what are their needs, particularly last year.
And then last part, statement slash question is, I know having an impact regarding wage tax for individuals who do not in Philadelphia. What's the dollar amount that has impacted our budget since people have been working from home? Can you give us that number?
Sure. So we don't, it's at this point pretty much impossible to tease out how much is because folks are, we're not getting it because they're working in the suburbs versus they lost that job versus their hours were cut versus their salary was cut. So we don't have the data to really pull it apart, but we had incorporated that into our wage tax estimates. And so our wage tax, we're expecting to be about $115 million less in FY20 than it was in $115 million less in FY21 than it was in FY20. And that's keeping in mind FY20's fourth quarter was a COVID quarter, and that was bad too. So we factored in those commuter costs, as well as all the other reasons why our wage tax is dropping, as residents have lost their jobs, as they've lost hours, as they've had salary reductions. So it's all in there together. We know some of the city's largest employers had already changed their withholding for their folks that were commuters who were staying outside. So some of that's already in the numbers we're seeing. But I mentioned that while waiting to see what happens with federal dollars is a lot of why we wanted to delay the budget introduction this year. Also, we continue to want to have more experience with our revenue collections. And so now is the time, if folks have gotten their W-2s, that folks whose employer hasn't changed their W-2 will be coming to us for refunds, those commuters. It is too early as of right now to sort of get a sense of the scale of that. But over the coming weeks, that's what we expect to be able to see is what are those refund requests from those non-residents looking like. So we've made some projections, and now we're in the phase of trying to, see how on target those projections were. In our quarterly city managers report, we did have to, based on our experience collecting so far this year, bring down our wage tax estimate from where it was. And so it's something we are really carefully watching on a weekly basis.
Hey, thank you very much, Marissa.
Madam Chairperson, I believe you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Marissa. Just one last thing, because you guys heard me say this last week. How does the water commissioner go and ask for a 17% increase when all of these things are in flux? Was the administration aware of this? How, the messaging, again, this is about messaging.
Yeah, I hear you about the messaging, and we can go back. I think that there's some requirements around the timing for their rate cases where they don't have the same flexibility to wait, but I'll try and find out what the timing was and get you more information about the thought process there.
Is there any discussion about the administration about holding back on that? I think, again, until we understand what the federal package looks like, until we're sitting here trying to figure out new ways to provide rental assistance and all of this stuff. And then in the mix of that, you get that kind of messaging. It's quite challenging and frustrating. We're trying to reassure folks that we know we have to tighten our belt, that we want to be better stewards of people's money, that we're going to realign this stuff. And then that comes out of nowhere. I just think it really adds to already trauma and tension by, the working poor with such, it's so drastic, double-digit increases of anything during a pandemic. And the last time they went for a increase at 11%, they got 1% from the rate board, and that was pre-pandemic. In a post-pandemic world, I don't even know how they think that's even possible. We're calling on the administration to really rescind that. I think people need to take a step back. There's a commitment by President Biden for a lot of infrastructure money. Not saying that we don't need some of the infrastructure stuff. I saw the water main breaks. I'm very clear around all of that stuff. But the messaging to poor people in the mix of that, when we know there's going to be infrastructure investments happening from the federal government, is just like the timing is off, totally off. I'm going to recognize Councilman Dom, who has an additional question. Councilman Dom?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess this question is from Marissa. I would like to see us, Marissa, prepare a budget, preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. And then also have a checklist of what's most, like if we have to reduce certain things, which of those reductions would be the most important for us to restore based on every $1 million if we get the money. We may not get the money. I think we have to be ready and show the government that, if we don't get the money, at least we have a plan to go forward. And if we get the money, that's great. And then I think that plan, if we get the money, includes whatever we think is most productive to put back in place, including more jobs, building our economy, et cetera. But I think that would be a great way to approach it.
Yeah, thank you. And so obviously we can only introduce one on the 15th, but internally we've got to we actually have 3 sort of scenarios that are just in play. One is happy day, we get more than enough to avoid budget cuts and make the new investments we want. One is the it's something, which means it helps, but it doesn't fully address our needs. And then we've got the oh dear Lord scenario, which is nothing or minimal. And so we're sort of thinking through what those look like in prioritizations. We work with our internal budget equity committee and other folks to weigh in so we understand, in each of those scenarios, where are we? What do we want to do? One of the things we talk about and we've heard you say is that we're not just thinking about cuts. We know there's actually some areas we're going to need to make new investments, even if that means deeper cuts elsewhere. And so that's in the mix as we're thinking this through and working our way towards the budget proposal for April 15th.
Would a guideline for you to go back to look at the budget of 2015, 2016 and see all the categories? Because I would say this, I think most people right now, we could return to the levels of 2016, especially in the hospitality world. They would be ecstatic. Okay, so is that a guideline that we could go back to the budgets of 15 and 16, realizing you can't let everything?
Well, I mean, so that's a challenge. That's an approach. I think that's challenging for us because we could go back to the dollar figures, but the cost of things have changed and the things we want have changed. And so we can go back to that, but there's certain costs that we can't control. Our insurance costs. There's certain pension costs. So just saying go back doesn't help us make sure. We can say, do we want the service levels we had then, and then try and figure that out. But as we've been looking at things, I think getting us 2015 service levels, we can't buy those at 2015 prices right now. Some things more, some things less. So we have to really just think about what is the appropriate level of service delivery and what is the most efficient way we can deliver that service. And so that's how we're thinking about where we toggle back is, what is the service level that we want to be providing in different areas.
And what is right now, our annual budget, is it 4.7, 4.8? Where are we at?
Yeah, so about 4.7 billion.
So back in 15.
In the operating, in our general fund, yeah.
I think 15, and I don't hold me to this, I think we were close to 3.9 to 4 billion, roughly. So I'm looking at this and saying, okay, there's 700 million we've increased in 4 or 5 years. Granted, there's rates of inflation and so forth, but I don't think the rates of inflation are amounting to the level of increase, which is like 18 or 19%.
No, and you're right. There have been areas where we've dramatically increased our funding, particularly around education. And so that's why are those the areas we'd want to pull back first, I think is the question they asked. We've the pre-K slots, community schools, the increased funding for CCP and for the school district that's where a lot of the increase has been. The share of the budget that goes to education since then has shifted. And that's actually a lot of what I'm looking at right now is the share of the budget instead of dollars. Our share of our funding that goes to education has been increasing dramatically. And so that's sort of the question is we're looking at priorities. Is that where we still want to be, or is that an area we want to toggle back? And that's what'll, go into the mayor's analysis of what proposal it comes back. But we're looking at where we've grown and where those, doing again, would we make those choices? And in some areas, the answer is likely yes. In some areas, the answer is going to be no.
And also, even the budget of $4 billion that was back in 15 or 16, I'm sure there was excess in that budget that could have been reduced. So I'm looking at this and saying, what do you think the shortfall is going to be for this year? Is it a 200 million shortfall? Is it 300 million? How much is the shortfall?
So we're thinking the shortfall for FY22, absent an additional round of federal relief, is 450 million. The cost, basically, that's the difference between our current revenue estimates, which we'll continue to tweak and we'll kick around at the Federal Reserve with a bunch of economists in the middle of next month. But our current revenue estimates plus our starting fund balance, which is a paltry 29 million. You know, we went into FY20 with 438 million, so we don't have very much cushion. But continuing to provide our current level of services will cost us more than 5 billion because of, there's this year's cost, and then there's areas where we see that there are increases that are just sort of unavoidable, out of our control, or other things. So that's where we get that gap, is just looking at current level of services. What would that cost to deliver? How much revenue do you think we'll have? Right now, looking like a $450 million difference between those two things.
What's surprising to me is just from the average Philadelphian, what I hear is that you've increased the budget by $700-800 million, but I don't feel I'm getting any more services or any better services. And in fact, in many cases, I'm getting less services. Mm-hmm. That's what's out there. I mean, think about that. No city can really think. That's kind of crazy that we increased our budget 18%. People think they're not getting as good a service as they did before. That's what we have to look at.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. And, I always caution folks when we talk about going back, because we've all agreed that going back was not good for a lot of people. And so I really believe that we have to challenge, and the budget will be very tense in this way. Because I agree with you, how we were running government and its efficiencies. We're a long way from that. The administration has a plan that they submitted to PICA for overtime. I am of the belief that we have departments with historical overtime issues, and it's the same people every year. We know who they are. And if their overtime is not producing outcomes, then it's not being managed around that piece. But I don't want folks to think that we're going to go back to the disparities that existed in government before, and that we're going to abandon our commitment to the most vulnerable. And you're right, people don't feel the same level of service. So it is a challenge. It's, that's why zero-based budgeting is important, because I think if there's any time in the history where we would be doing it is after a pandemic, and saying we can't go back. We really have to move forward in a more equitable way. So I agree with you with that. I'm very cautious about us saying 5% cuts across the board, 10% cuts across the board, because, those formulas are not going to work for the government we'd like to see. It's just not going to be fair. Thank you, Marissa. Is there any other questions from the committee? No other witnesses here to testify. I would ask that if there's anyone else present whose name we failed to call and that wishes to offer testimony of any of these bills being considered today. So hearing none, I want to thank all the panel and witnesses for their participation today. We value the opinions. We invite all panel and witnesses to please disconnect from the meeting before we go into our public meeting. We will now pause briefly as multiple participants leave the hearing. Okay, this concludes the public hearing of the committee, and we will now go into a public meeting to consider the actions to be taken on bills before this committee today. Eric, can you please call the roll? The members that are in attendance, as we did in the beginning, if you are present, please do so with a few brief words so that your image can be displayed on the screen when you speak.
Councilmember Quinones Sanchez.
Present.
Councilmember Johnson.
Present.
Councilmember Thomas.
Present.
Councilmember Heenan.
Present, Madam Chair.
And Councilmember Dom.
Present.
Thank you. We will now go into our public meeting. Councilman Dom, I just got a note from you. Did you want to put that on the record?
Yes, Madam Chair. I wanted us to consider holding the COVID bill, the $50 million, until we see a plan from the administration. Thank you.
So what I offered before around holding up for a final vote if a plan is not in place is not sufficient, council member?
I just feel that we'll have a better plan if we hold the vote on this now, so they know that we mean real business here. Otherwise, I think we lose some benefits by approving it out of committee. I think if we don't approve it out of committee, I think the administration will understand that they really have to dig in and give us a plan. But I'm willing to go along with the committee if you think differently. That's just my opinion.
I'd like to hear from any other committee members how they feel about that. I don't want to put you guys on the spot, but we would have to vote on this.
Okay, this is Councilmember Thomas. I understand Councilmember Dom's reluctance, but I do get that we can put ourselves in a position to say that we won't bring it to a final vote until we have an actual plan. So I can go either way, honestly, but I do get the concern around a plan. I think just, basic, simple questions like, and even you, Madam Chair, had questions that just couldn't be answered today because the information wasn't there. So I can go either way.
Yeah, Madam Chair, and we've been through this process before in the past. I'm comfortable with voting it out of committee with a caveat that before we move on a final vote on the floor, that all of the questions that Councilmember Dom, as well as the other members, have provided to the administration in terms of the actual plan so they can feel comfortable on final vote. That would be my approach. That's what I think that should be done from my perspective.
Madam Chair, this is Bobby Heenan. I want to echo what the members of the committee have been talking about with, getting a little more of a clearer plan. I'm going to vote it out of committee with that understanding prior to final passage. And just remember, once it hits the floor of City Council, it opens itself up, the appropriation bill, to a lot more members of council who I'm sure are looking for a lot more clarity themselves. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilmember Dom, did you want to add?
I'm probably going to be a no vote, only because I want to see the plan. I want to see the plan before I vote. No plan, no vote. Councilmember Dom, I'm inclined to agree with you. And if it wasn't because we were dealing with COVID and trying to put plans together, and I know, for instance, in my district, as I've expressed to you, we're working with several providers that finally are getting, are being part of this plan. I would also hold it up at the committee, because I don't think the administration has taken your concerns as seriously as they should. And that concerns me because today, your issue, you've been very clear on this issue. All of us on this committee have been in similar situations where we've had a concern and we don't really feel like the administration is listening. And I don't, we're at a time where the administration needs to take your particular concerns, the dashboard. Again, Councilwoman Bass and the rest of the members of the committee on Friday were very clear about several issues. The bill at hand that you're most concerned about, which is, Bill 21, I will tell you that if we don't have a plan by the time this goes to a full vote in 2 weeks, I'd be the first one to join you and not call it for a final vote. As chair of this committee, I have the authority to do that, and I want you to understand that I will stand with you on that because we are very concerned. My only concern with this is there are some plans that are moving forward, and I don't want to prohibit the administration from moving forward in those. Those include some additional work with the Black doctors and again, some of my federally certified health centers in the district. But I hope that they understand that we are serious about it. And I agree with my colleagues that this would not be the first time we hold something up on the floor if we don't feel like people are being heard. Madam Chair?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to mention, the administration has had, how many months did COVID start? March of last year? They've had at least 6 or 8 months to have a plan. Well, how's that going to change in the next week? Unless we force the issue.
I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I'm not going to sit here and defend
Right.
what has been more than a bumpy rollout. This is people's lives. So I'm not going to argue it. Again, my concern is there are some plans that are moving forward, and I don't want to limit the administration's ability to set up those things to get a plan in order. If in a week, and again, Council President committed to this last Thursday, if in a week we don't see more materialized cohesiveness on a citywide plan, I think the members of this committee, Councilman Heenan, Johnson, and Isaiah Thomas, have all committed that we will not call it up for a vote, and they have to take this serious. So I hope that is sufficient for you. I'm completely okay with you voting no on this bill if you want, to set the record straight for yourself. We're okay with that. We have 2 other bills because these are 3 bills, but please feel free to vote against this bill, and we will join you in calling on the administration to provide that dashboard, real-time information, a real plan that looks at equity, recognizing that in order to get to that more equitable situation, we have to overcompensate, and that there be established goals as we get more vaccines. We're up to 30-something thousand a week. I hope that in 2 weeks we're debating on where to distribute 50,000 of those. So I agree with you totally.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So Councilman Johnson, are you ready for me?
Absolutely.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Councilmember Johnson for a motion on Bill 210120. On a motion on the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I offer an amendment to Bill number 210120. A copy of the amendment has been circulated to all members of the committee. I move that the amendment to Bill number 210120 be approved. Second.
Do I have a second? All those in favor. This is a technical amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any oppositions?
Nay.
It has been moved. This is not the bill. It's 21. I'll let you know which one it is.
All right.
Okay. It has been moved and properly seconded that the amendment to Bill 210120 be approved. All those in favor say, yeah, we did that. I'm sorry. The yeas have it, and the amendment to the bill has been approved. Trying to follow the script. The chair recognizes Councilmember Johnson for a motion on the bill as amended for Bill 210120.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that Bill number 210120 as amended be reported from this committee with the favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
Second.
All those in favor, it has been moved and properly seconded that bill number 210120 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next council session. All those in favor say aye.
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 The yeas have it. Any those opposed? Seeing none, the ayes have it, and the motion carries. The chair recognizes Councilmember Johnson for a motion on Bill 210077.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that Bill number 210077 be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded that bill number 210077 be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next council session. All those in favor will motion by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion carries. Now, this is the bill, Councilmember Dom. The chair recognizes Councilmember Johnson for a motion on Bill 210121.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that bill number 210121 be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
I need a second.
Second.
Thank you. The bill has been moved and properly seconded that bill number 210121 be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading at the next council session. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Nay.
Let the record reflect that Councilmember Alan Dom has voted against it. That the ayes have it, and the motion carries. This concludes the business before this committee on appropriations today. I want to thank all of the council members, and again, Councilmember Dom, we agree with you, and we will hope that the administration will heed to the call on such an important issue. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the members.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.